My brother told everyone I stole the money, the bank cameras proved otherwise. My name is Renata Claire Holloway. I am 37 years old, and my brother stood in our mother's kitchen in front of 11 people and told them I had stolen $42,000 from our father's estate. That is where I usually start this story. That moment in the kitchen on Easter Sunday, the way the fluorescent light above the stove made everyone look slightly pale, or maybe that was just the moment itself doing something to people's faces. The way my sister-in-law Stacy was holding a dish towel she'd stopped using a full minute before my brother opened his mouth, just standing there with it in both hands the way you hold something when you forgot you were holding it. The way my mother didn't look at me. Not away from me, not at the ceiling or the floor, but just not at me, that specific and deliberate redirection of a person's eyes that tells you more than looking would. The way my father's oldest crew member, Vic Bowen, a man who had known me since I was 8 years old, shifted his weight from his left foot to his right while my brother was talking and then back again, like he was trying to find a position in which all of this would be easier to stand inside of. That kitchen moment is what I lead with because it is the cleanest part of the story. It has a beginning and an end and a clear line between before and after. That's why I go there first. But that is not actually where it started. Let me go back. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories. This is where we share real-life inspired tales of family conflict, betrayal, and the quiet strength it takes to stand your ground. If these stories speak to you, drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. My father's name was Harold Gene Holloway. He was 68 years old when he died, and he spent the last 3 years of his life watching what he had spent 30 years building get quietly reorganized around him by a man who had already decided it was his. That man is my brother Darren. Darren is 40 years old now, was 38 then. He sells commercial real estate in Raleigh, North Carolina, and he has for going on 15 years. He is the kind of man who gets to the restaurant early and learns the server's name before the food comes and overtips in a way that makes you feel like a witness rather than a guest. He sends Christmas cards every year, handwritten ones to clients and to his children's teachers and to the people who delivered his mail. He coached Little League for 2 seasons until something came up, and the parents from that league still talk about him fondly at the kinds of events where people talk about things fondly. He is, by every visible social measure, a good son, a good brother, a contributor to the community. He is the kind of man whose name comes up in rooms he has already left, and it comes up positively. That is the part you need to understand before anything else. Because none of what happened would have happened the way it happened if Darren were a simpler person or a more obviously bad one. The version of this story where the villain is cartoonish is easier to tell and easier to dismantle. That is not this story. Before I get to that Easter kitchen, I need to back up further than I have been to a place I keep skipping when I tell this story. I skip it because it requires me to say something about my father that I don't say easily, and I'll get there eventually. But first, you need to understand the whole architecture of what we were all walking into. My father was a contractor, not a developer, not a project manager, not a real estate investor in the way people mean that word now. A contractor. He built houses and small commercial spaces in Wake County and the surrounding area for 31 years, starting in 1983 when he was 25 years old and had a used pickup truck and a relationship with a lumber yard in Cary and not much else. By the time I was born in 1987, he had 2 employees. By the time I was in high school, Holloway Construction had 6 full-time employees and a reputation that generated referrals without advertising, which is the kind of reputation that takes a decade of consistent work to build and can be undone in a season. He owned 2 rental properties in Garner, one on Pinecrest Drive and one on Dodd Street, both bought in 1998, both paid off by 2007. He was not a wealthy man in the way that word gets used. He was a careful man, which is a different thing entirely, and he knew the difference, and he lived his life inside that difference, and he wanted both of his children to understand that this was a choice he had made on purpose. Darren understood it the way someone understands a speed limit they intend to follow only when there are cameras. I understood it the way I understood my own. Breathing. I am a forensic accountant. I have worked for the same firm, Aldridge and Mercer, out of their Durham office on Chapel Hill Street since 2011. I passed the CPA exam in 2010, 1 year out of NC State, and I earned my certified fraud examiner credential in 2013, which required 2 years of professional experience in addition to the examination. What I do in plain terms is sit across from people who believe they have hidden things carefully and find what they hid. I look at numbers and I find the ones that don't belong. I find the transfers that happened on Saturdays when no one was looking. I find the accounts in different names that route back to the same address. I find the pattern underneath the noise and then I write a report, and sometimes that report goes to the IRS and sometimes to a district attorney and sometimes just to a company's board of directors, and after that point it is no longer my problem. I am telling you this because I need you to hold it. I need you to hold the specific fact that my brother, who knows what I do for a living and has known for 15 years, who has asked me questions at Thanksgiving dinners about how money laundering works and how people get caught, who has listened to me explain my work with genuine curiosity on at least a dozen occasions, that this man looked me in the face at an Easter dinner in April 2021 and accused me of financial fraud in front of 11 witnesses. He knew exactly what he was saying and to whom he was saying it. I have spent a long time holding that particular fact, turning it over the way you turn a stone over to see what's living under it. I have not yet found the bottom of it. My father got sick in January of 2019. Not the sudden kind of sick, not the phone call that splits a day in half, the other kind. The kind that starts as something you explain away, a cough that runs a little long, a tiredness that feels like a little more than tiredness, a morning where you look in the bathroom mirror and something is slightly different about the person looking back, but you can't quite name what it is yet. My mother made him go to his doctor, a general practitioner named Weaver at a practice on Tryon Road in Cary. Weaver sent him to a pulmonologist at WakeMed's main campus on New Bern Avenue. The pulmonologist ordered a CT scan. My father sat in the waiting room at WakeMed Radiology on a Thursday morning in January 2019 and then he went back to work for 3 days because the results weren't in yet and there was a kitchen remodel in Apex he was trying to finish before the clients got back from a trip. The results came in on a Tuesday, stage 3 non-small cell lung cancer. He called me from the parking garage at WakeMed. I know this because I could hear the particular quality of that kind of echo in the background, concrete and close. My phone rang on a Tuesday afternoon and I was in the parking deck at Northgate Mall in Durham because I had been running an errand on my lunch break and I had just sat back down in the driver's seat. I didn't answer the first time because I didn't recognize the number, and then I looked more carefully and saw the 919 area code, and something, not a thought exactly but something, made me call it back. My father's voice was the same as it always was, not performing anything. He said, "Well, the news isn't great, but I've been in tighter spots." I said, "What kind of spots, Dad?" He said, "I'll explain when I see you." And then, without a pause that I could notice, he said, "I need you to come down this weekend. I need you to come alone." I didn't ask why alone, I said I'd be there Saturday. I need to stop here because I have a habit in this story of jumping ahead to the places I know better. The comfortable places where I already understand what happened and why. The middle part is where I lose the thread, and I need to make myself stay in it this time. That Saturday, February 9th, 2019, I drove down Highway 70 south from Durham to Garner, 2 hours and 20 minutes depending on the traffic around the Beltline, and I pulled into my parents' driveway on Timber Glen Court at 10:40 in the morning. My mother's Accord was gone. She was at her sister Phyllis's house. My father had arranged that. He was sitting at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad in front of him and a pen and a mug of coffee that had been sitting long enough that I could tell from the color it had gone lukewarm at minimum. He looked thinner, not dramatically, not in the way that would make a stranger stop and notice. In the way that you notice on someone you know well, a change in proportion that is subtle and specific to that face. He had lost maybe 12 pounds in the 5 weeks since his diagnosis. The kind of loss that changes the way a person's face sits on their skull, where the underlying structure starts to show through. In a way it hadn't before. We sat at that table for 4 hours. He didn't get up to refill the coffee. I made a pot at some point and brought him a fresh mug, and he thanked me and held it with both hands and kept talking. The legal pad had 4 pages of his handwriting. Not a will, he had a will. His attorney, Keith Satterfield at Satterfield and Bloom on Maynard Road in Cary, had been holding it since 2011 when my parents updated their estate documents after they paid off the second rental property. What my father had been writing down on the legal pad was everything the will didn't contain: the rental properties and what they generated in rent each month. The business accounts at First Citizens, the operating account and the payroll account, the equipment, the 2 trucks and the table saw and the air compressors and the transit and the levels and all the small pieces of a working contractor's shop that had been accumulated over 3 decades. The retirement account at Fidelity, about $211,000 with my mother named as primary beneficiary. The personal savings account, also at First Citizens, account ending in 4471, with a balance as of February 1st of $42,317. That account, that number, I need you to hold it and keep holding it. My father said the business goes to Darren. We've already had that conversation and he knows it. He knows the clients, he's been helping me with bids for 3 years, and I want the crew to stay employed. That matters to me more than anything in that category. I said, I understand, Dad. He said the properties, Pinecrest and Dodd, those go to your mother. She's going to need income. The rental income on those two properties together is about $2,200 a month after expenses. That's a livable number for a woman in a paid-off house. I said, yes, okay. He said the Fidelity account that's already set up with her as beneficiary that just goes directly to her when I'm gone, that's outside the estate. I said, I know how those work. He said, I know you do. And then he paused. He looked down at the legal pad and he flattened the page with his hand, the way he did when he was about to say something he had thought about carefully. He said, the First Citizens Savings Account, the 42,000, I want that to go to you. I said, why me and not split between us? He was quiet for a moment. He looked out the kitchen window at the backyard, at the bird feeder hanging from the oak tree. I had given him that feeder the Christmas before, a cedar one from a shop in Cabarrot. He had put it up the same day I gave it to him, went out in the afternoon cold to hang it from the oak tree's second branch, and by New Year's Eve there were cardinals coming every morning and he texted me a photo of one. He said, Renata, in 35 years of being your father, you have never asked me for a thing. You paid for college yourself, loans and work study, you didn't take money from us. When you were studying for your certifications and working full-time, you called your mother every week and you never mentioned the money part even when I could tell it was tight. You have never in your life called me and said, Dad, I need help. And I know that is not because you have never needed help. That is because you are made a particular way. I want to give you this and I want to give it to you while I can still watch it happen. I looked at the bird feeder through the window. A chickadee was sitting on the edge of it, not eating, just perched there looking at the yard. I said, what does Darren know about this? My father said enough. I didn't ask what enough meant. I did not ask him to be more specific. I watched the chickadee fly away and I thought I should ask him what he means by enough, and then I looked at my father's face, at the way he was holding the mug with both hands, at the way his shoulders were carrying something they hadn't been carrying at Christmas 2 months ago, and I let the question go. That was the first mistake. It was not a dramatic mistake, not the kind that announces itself. It was just a small door that I chose not to open. Those doors compound over time. My father's treatment began in March of 2019. Chemotherapy first, concurrent with radiation, a regimen the oncologist at Duke Cancer Center described as aggressive and appropriate for his staging. My father drove himself to his first 2 infusions at the Duke Cancer Center clinic on Morris Street before my mother made him stop. And then she drove him for the next 6 months, and he spent the drive time telling her about whatever job he was trying to finish, and she told me later that she learned more about carpentry and rough framing and how to set a ridge beam from those drives than she had learned in 30 years of being married to him. I want to tell you about those 22 months, not all of them, but enough. What managing someone's finances during a serious illness actually means, in practical terms, is that you become the person who knows all the passwords. You become the person who calls the insurance company 3 times in 1 week because a claim was denied and then denied again on appeal, and you need to speak to a supervisor, and you have the explanation of benefits and the medical billing codes on the desk in front of you, and you are not getting off this call until someone fixes this. You become the person who notices that the business payroll account is short by $400 on a Thursday because there was a bank processing delay, and you call the bank before your father's crew wakes up on Friday and wonder why their direct deposits are missing. Darren knew I was doing this. He knew because I told him. I called him in May of 2019 and I explained that Dad had given me power of attorney and that I was managing the accounts, and that if he ever had a question about the business finances, he could call me directly. Darren said, okay, that makes sense. He said, keep me in the loop. I said, I will, and I did for a while. I sent him a summary email in July of 2019 covering the business accounts, the medical costs year to date, what the insurance had covered, and what remained. He replied with one line, thanks Renata, good work. After that, I sent similar summaries in October and again in January 2020, and he responded to each one. By the time the second round of treatment began in April 2020, I had stopped sending the summaries because I was managing the accounts in real time, and things were moving fast enough that a monthly summary was obsolete before it was written. That is not a defense of myself, that is context. In the fall of 2020, in the last weeks, Darren and I had a phone call that I have not yet told you about. This was in late October. My father had been in the hospital bed for 3 weeks at that point. I was driving back to Durham from a weekend in Garner and I had just gotten on the 147 when Darren called. He said, "How long do you think?" I said the nurse said possibly a few weeks. She said it's hard to know. He said, "I'm going to need to move fast on the business once." He stopped. He said, "Once things settle." I said, "Keith has everything laid out. The transition is straightforward." He said, "The equipment inventory, do you have that?" I said, "Dad gave me a list in February 2019. It's in the estate file, but you should verify it against what's actually in the shop because some of it may have changed." He said, "What about the accounts?" I said, "What about them?" He said, "I'm going to need to know what's in the business accounts so I can plan the transition." I said, "Darren, Keith is going to go through all of that with you after. That's his job and that's the right order of operations. Right now I'm just focused on making sure things run smoothly until." He said, "Yeah, I know." He said, "It just feels like a lot." I said, "I know it does." He said, "You've been managing all of this." I said, "Yes." He said, "I appreciate it. I know you've been doing a lot." I said, "We're both doing what we can." He said, "Yeah," and then after a pause he said, "He's proud of you, he told me. He said he didn't worry about the money side because of you." I did not say anything for a moment. The lights of the highway were coming up around me and I was watching the road and holding the phone and thinking about my father in the hospital bed on Timber Glen Court and what he might have said to Darren in those quiet weekend visits and how those same conversations were the ones where apparently he had not said the specific thing that would have prevented all of this. I said, "I love him, that's all I'm doing." Darren said, "I know, me too." We hung up. I drove the rest of the way home. I have thought about that phone call a great many times since Easter 2021. I have thought about how close we were in that phone call to being two people who understood each other's roles and trusted the process. I have thought about how thin the wall was between that and what happened instead. By the fall of 2019, the cancer had responded. Not gone, but smaller, retreated. His oncologist used the word encouraging. My father described it as a tactical withdrawal on the cancer's part and said he did not intend to give it the opportunity to regroup. He went back to working full days 3 weeks after his last scheduled infusion. He called me on a Sunday in November and said he had just gotten off a roof and his legs still worked fine, and I said, "Dad, please get off roofs." He laughed. But it came back. That is the nature of stage 3 non-small cell. In the spring of 2020 at the follow-up scans, there it was again. Different sites, more spread. His oncologist sat down with him and my mother and outlined the options, which were a second line of treatment that would be harder and would buy time rather than cure. And my father said how much time, and the oncologist said it was difficult to say with confidence. And my father said, "Give me the range," and the oncologist said 6 to 18 months was the honest answer. My father started the second line of treatment in April of 2020. This is also when he called Keith Satterfield and asked him to come to the house to update the estate documents and to set up a power of attorney. He called me the same week and told me what he had done and told me he was naming me as his agent under the power of attorney. He said, "You understand money and I need someone who understands money." I said, "What about Darren?" He said, "Darren is going to have enough to manage with the business." I said, "Okay, Dad." He said, "Keith will call you with the paperwork." Keith called me on April 14th, 2020. We went through the power of attorney document on a video call because it was April of 2020 and nothing was happening in person. Keith is 61 years old and has the particular quality of a man who has delivered a lot of news to a lot of families and has learned that precision is a form of care. He went through every section clearly. He explained what I could authorize and what I could not. He said, "You won't need this for a while, hopefully, but when the time comes, it will let you make financial and medical decisions on his behalf, and he is choosing you for that role." I said, "Does Darren know I'm the agent?" Keith said, "Harold is going to tell him." I said, "Okay." I did not follow up on whether that conversation happened. I assumed it had. That was the kind of assumption you make when you are managing a caseload at a fraud investigation firm and your father is sick and your mother is exhausted, and there are only so many things you can track simultaneously. The second line of treatment bought 7 months. My father was in and out of the hospital twice in the fall of 2020, once in September for a pulmonary event that turned out to be less serious than the ER presentation suggested, and once in October for pain management. In between those hospitalizations, he was home in the bedroom on Timber Glen Court, and by the end of October, he was in a hospital bed that had been moved into the room, and there were visiting nurses. rotating schedule, and my mother had figured out the medication management with a level of competence that still moves me when I think about it. She had a notebook. She tracked everything in a notebook with tabs. Darren came down from Raleigh on weekends. He sat with my father. He did practical things, fixed things around the house, took my mother grocery shopping. He was attentive in the way that looks like love and probably is love. I was there every other weekend and on the phone with my mother every other day and managing the finances, which by October meant monitoring the accounts and making sure the business payroll was processing correctly even as my father was no longer able to oversee it directly. In late October, my father asked me to come down on a Tuesday, just me. He was having a clearer day, he said, and there were things he wanted to go through. I drove down on October 20th and we sat together for about 2 hours, him in the hospital bed with the back raised so he could sit up, me in the chair my mother usually sat in. He told me that Keith had instructions to release the estate documents after his death and that I should call Keith first before anyone else. He said the first citizen's account should be moved, that I should move it using the power of attorney to the joint account we had set up, a joint account at BB&T in both my name and my mother's name, set up in October at his request specifically for this purpose. He was specific, he told me the account number, he told me the timing, wait until after the funeral because there would be other things to manage first. He said Stacy and Darren have their hands in enough. I don't want that account touched before it's moved. I said I understood. He said, I need you to tell me you understand. I said, Dad, I understand, I will handle it. He died on November 10th, 2020. A Tuesday. I drove down on November 8th when my mother called to say it was close and I stayed. Darren was there. We were all three in the room when it happened, my mother in the chair on his left and Darren standing at the foot of the bed and me in the chair on his right, and the room made a particular quality of silence afterward that I have no words for and don't expect to find any. We buried him on Saturday, November 14th, at Mount Pisgah Methodist Church in Garner, where my parents had been members for 23 years. The weather was cold in the specific dry way that November in North Carolina sometimes manages, no wind, just still cold air with a flat sky. I remember what I was wearing, and I remember the feel of the wooden pew, and I remember the smell of the church, which was the smell it had always been, and I remember watching Darren give the eulogy and thinking that my father would have been proud of how he handled it. He did not break down. He talked about the work, the actual work, the framing and the roofing, and the satisfaction my father took in standing back and looking at a finished thing. He talked about the crew. He talked about taking his kids to job sites and how my father had given them both their own small levels and told them the most important skill in the world was learning to see what was true and what only looked true. 3 of my father's former employees cried. I sat in the pew and watched it all from behind my own eyes, the way you watch something too large to stand inside of directly. On November 18th, 2020, 1 week after the funeral, I transferred $42,317 from my father's First Citizens Savings account ending in 4471, to the joint account at BB&T using the power of attorney instrument that had been properly filed and was on record. The transfer took 4 minutes at the bank. Diane Aucuffer, the branch manager at the First Citizens location on Highway 70 in Garner, processed it. The documentation was attached and noted in the transaction record. I drove home to Durham. I called Keith Satterfield the following Monday and told him the transfer had been made. He said good, and he noted it in the estate file. I did not call Darren's. That was the second mistake, and I want to be honest about what it was and what it wasn't. It was not an accident. I was not careless. I was tired and I was grieving, and I told myself he was grieving too, and I told myself it could wait until I had been through the formal estate process with Keith and had the documents in hand, and I told myself Darren understood enough of the situation from what my father had told him, whatever enough had meant. Every one of those things I told myself was true, none of them was sufficient. I called Darren in January of 2021 to set up a time to go through everything with him, the estate documents, the transfer, all of it. He didn't answer. I left a message. He didn't call back. I called again 10 days later, voicemail again. I left another message and said, Darren, I know you're managing a lot. Take your time. I'm here whenever you're ready. Then I let it sit because his wife Stacy had called my mother to say he was having a hard time with the grief and I did not want to push. February became March. March became the middle of March, and I was deep inside a fraud case at Aldridge and Mercer involving a property management company in Cary, and the First Citizens transfer was sitting safely in a properly documented account, and nothing was urgent because nothing was going anywhere. Then I called my mother on a Sunday night in late March, and she was quiet in a way I recognized. The quality of quiet that means a person has been holding something and isn't sure yet how to set it down. I said, Mom, what's wrong? She said, Renata, Darren says there's a problem with the accounts. I said, what kind of problem? She said, he thinks some money is missing. I said, what do you mean missing? She said, he says he's looking into it. He's been going through your father's bank statements. My stomach dropped and stayed there. I knew. I knew the way I know things professionally, the way I look at a spreadsheet and feel the shape of a discrepancy before I've run the analysis. I knew what was happening. I sat with the phone against my face in my kitchen in Durham and I thought, he has seen the transfer record and he has built a story around it that does not include the power of attorney or the joint account or my name being on anything, and he has started telling that story to our mother. And then I thought, does he not know about the joint account? Could he genuinely not know? And then I thought, he has seen the estate documents. Keith went through everything with both of us. The power of attorney was in the estate file, he had to have seen it. And then I made myself stop, because I was sitting in my kitchen on a Sunday night and I did not have the documents in front of me, and I have a rule about this. I do not draw conclusions without documents. I said, Mom, let me look into a few things and I'll call you back this week. She said, he says he has evidence. I said, I'm sure he has something he's calling evidence. Let me see what it actually is. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, he sounds very sure, Renata. I said, he usually does. That came out sharper than I intended. I heard it after it left my mouth. My mother didn't respond to it. I said goodnight and I hung up and I stood in my kitchen for a while. At Easter, April 4th, 2021, I drove down to Garner because I always drove down for Easter and because my mother had called twice to confirm I was coming, and I understood from the quality of those calls that something was being organized. I parked in the driveway on Timber Glen Court and walked up to the front door and went inside, and there were 11 people in that kitchen. My mother and her sister Phyllis, Darren and Stacy, their kids Maya and Connor, who were 8 and 6 and completely innocent and were playing something involving a toy truck on the living room floor. Vic and Terrence Bowen, who were brothers and had worked for my father's crew for 19 and 14 years respectively. Vic had been my father's most trusted lad. He had been at the funeral. He had a way of standing that was very still and very present. Glenn Purifoy, my father's neighbor, retired, the man who had given my father a bottle of scotch every Christmas for 12 years and who was sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of sweet tea. And two other people, a couple, friends of Darren and Stacy's who I had met maybe twice, whose names I did not know well enough to retain. I walked in and I felt the room before I understood it, the stopped quality, the way a conversation stops that is different from the way a conversation pauses. I set my purse on the counter beside the door and I said Happy Easter and I started taking off my coat. My brother said, actually, before we sit down. I stopped, my coat was halfway off my left shoulder, I left it there, I looked at him. He was standing near the refrigerator. He was holding his phone but not looking at it. Stacy was holding a dish towel. She had been drying a bowl and she had stopped, her hands still around the cloth, the bowl on the counter beside her. Darren said there was a savings account at First Citizens Bank, account ending in 4471, $42,000. It was there in November and then it was gone, transferred out right after Dad's funeral, and I need to know what happened to it. He was looking at me, the whole room was looking at me. Vic Bowen shifted his weight from his left foot to his right. Glenn Purifoy set his sweet tea down on the table. I want to tell you every single thing I thought in the silence that followed. I thought he has done this in front of witnesses. On purpose, he has calculated that I will either deny it and sound defensive or go silent and seem guilty, and either option serves him. I thought he does not have the joint account information or he is banking on me not saying it out loud. I thought my mother is looking at the kitchen floor. I thought Vic Bowen is 62 years old and he worked for my father for 19 years and whatever he decides right now is going to stick. I thought the words I need to say are simple, but saying them in this room, in this format with 11 people watching me defend myself, would still feel like submission, because the setup requires a defense and a defense legitimizes the charge. And then the last thought, the one underneath all the others, he knew about the power of attorney, he had to have known, and he did this anyway. I looked at my brother's face for a long moment. He did not look away. He had his certain face on, the one I had been watching since we were children, the face that has decided something has already happened and is now simply presenting the evidence. He does it with his chin very slightly lifted. He does it with his hands still. I said, I hear you. I picked up my purse, I finished taking off my coat, and then I put it back on. I looked at my mother, who was still not looking at me, and I said, Mom, I need a few days. She followed me to the door. She touched my arm in the entry hall and she said, Renata, he has receipts. I said, I know what he has. She said, he's talked to people at the bank. I said, I know, I'll call you Thursday. She looked at me and her eyes were doing the thing they did when she was afraid and not letting it be afraid yet. I said, Mom, I promise. I got in my car. I drove out of the neighborhood and onto Timber Glen and turned onto Highway 70. About half a mile down 70, there is a Bojangles. I pulled into its parking lot and put the car in park and put both hands on the wheel. The thing I have to tell you, the thing I have been building toward for this entire story, the thing that turns everything I just described into something different from what it looked like in that kitchen, is this. The $42,317 that my brother just accused me of stealing in front of 11 people, including 2 men who had worked for my father for a combined 33 years, was moved into an account with 2 names on it, mine and my mother's. It was moved using a power of attorney that was legally executed, properly filed, and on record at First Citizens Bank, the bank my brother had just told 11 people had cameras that would prove I was a thief. The transfer had Diane Acuffer's name on the authorization, it had a transaction number, it had a timestamp, it had attached to it the filed power of attorney instrument number, the date of my father's signature, the notarization, all of it. My mother had a debit card for the receiving account. Her name was on it. The monthly statements went to the house on Timber Glen Court to my mother's mailbox with her name on them. My brother had been in that kitchen talking about bank cameras. I sat in the Bojangles parking lot and I thought very clearly, he either does not know about the joint account and has been misreading documents, or he knows about it and did that anyway. I did not yet know which one it was. I wasn't sure which one was worse. I called Keith Satterfield's office first thing Monday morning. His assistant Pamela put me through. I explained the situation in 4 sentences. Keith said, Renata, I will pull the complete estate file and I will have a full documentation packet to you by Wednesday. I said I need it to include the power of attorney, the transfer record from First Citizens, the joint account setup documentation, and the estate summary you prepared in January. He said it will include all of that. He paused and then said, Do you need me to make any calls on your behalf? I said, Not yet. Let me try to handle this within the family first. He said, Okay, and then he said, For what it's worth, the record is clear. I said, I know, that's what I'm counting on. Wednesday, May 5th, 2021, the documentation packet arrived from Keith Satterfield. He had emailed it and sent a hard copy via overnight courier, 41 pages. Cover letter, estate summary, power of attorney instrument, the letter my father had written in October explaining his wishes regarding the First Citizens account, a certified copy of the transfer record from the bank, the BB&T joint account opening documentation with both names, the account statement for April showing the balance intact and untouched. I printed all 41 pages on the printer in my home office. I set them on my desk. I read through them in order, slowly, the way I read documents for work, marking nothing, just reading. I have to tell you, something about reading your own father's handwriting in a document that was written in October of a year he did not survive. The letter he had written was 2 paragraphs, typed and printed on his own printer at home and signed in blue ink. The signature was shakier than his usual signature. I have his signature from dozens of documents going back years, and this one was shakier, not dramatically, just in the particular way that illness changes the quality of the hand. I read those 2 paragraphs 3 times, the first time for the legal content, the second time because I needed to, the third time I don't have an explanation for. He said in the letter that he was directing his daughter Renata Claire Holloway, acting as his agent under the power of attorney executed April 14, 2020, to transfer the balance of his First Citizens savings account to the joint account held in her name and in the name of Evelyn Louise Holloway, his wife. He said the purpose of the joint account was to ensure his wife had access to the funds without the funds becoming entangled in estate administration or business succession. He said Renata had his full authorization. He said he had discussed this with his attorney Keith Satterfield, and Keith was aware of the arrangement. 2 paragraphs signed in blue ink, shakier than usual. I put the document back in the stack, and I put the stack in a manila envelope, and I wrote the date on the outside of the envelope. I called my mother on Tuesday. I said, Mom, I need you to come to the First Citizens branch with me on Thursday. I need you to look at some documents with me. She said, Renata, Darren says he spoke to someone at the bank and they confirmed the money was transferred out with no authorization on record. My chest went flat, not tight, flat, like something being pressed without pressure. I said, Darren spoke to who at the bank? She said, someone I don't know who. He called and they told him there was no authorization attached to the transfer. I said, Mom, please come with me on Thursday and look at the actual records with me. Not something Darren was told, the actual records. She was quiet. Then she said, okay. Have you ever had someone build a case against you using real facts? Just real facts with the context cut out, so that the foundation of what they're saying is solid even though the structure they've put on top of it is completely wrong? Because it's different from being lied about outright, it's different from someone making something up. When they use actual numbers, actual events, actual dates, but they arrange them in a way that removes the piece that changes everything, that's a specific kind of wrong that I don't have a clean word for. Tell me in the comments if you've been inside that. I read every single one, and if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time because what happens next is the part I've been building toward this whole time. Thursday, May 6, 2021, 9:45 in the morning. I met my mother in the parking lot of the First Citizens branch on Highway 70 in Garner, the same branch where my father had banked for 11 years, the one Diane Acuffer managed. I had called ahead on Wednesday to let Deanne know I was coming and that I would need to pull the full transaction history on the account. She said she'd be available. My mother pulled in 2 spaces down from me. She was wearing the blue cardigan. She wears it when she's uncertain about something. I know her that well, and probably she knows she gives that away and doesn't care at this point. We walked in together, and Diane came out of her office in a navy blazer and said, Ms. Holloway, of course, come on back. Both of us. Diane had a glass of water on her desk and a box of tissues on the credenza behind her that I noticed because I have a habit of noticing whether there are tissues in a room, not because I was going to cry, but because of what it says about what kinds of conversations tend to happen there. Diane pulled up the account on her computer. She turned the screen so we could both see it clearly. I said, can you show us the account ownership information first? She clicked to the account summary page. Both names were at the top. Renata Claire Holloway, Evelyn Louise Holloway, my mother's full name in the same size text as mine. My mother leaned forward in her chair. She looked at the screen. She made a sound small through her nose, the kind that is not quite a word and is not quite a breath. I said, Diane, can we see the transfer record from November 18th, 2020? Diane clicked through. The transfer record came up. Transfer amount 42,317. Originating account the First Citizens Savings account ending in 4471. Receiving account the BB&T joint account. Authorization documentation attached. Power of attorney instrument filing number HGH 2020-0414 executed April 14th, 2020. Notarized, signature Renata Claire Holloway agent, branch authorization Diane Acuffer branch manager, transaction timestamp, November 18th, 2022, 14 p.m. I said, is there anything on this record that would indicate unauthorized access? Diane said no, everything is in order. The power of attorney is properly filed, the receiving account is jointly held, the authorization is on record. I said if someone called this branch and asked about the authorization on this transfer, what would they be told? Diane looked at the record for a moment. She said they would be told the transfer is fully authorized and documented. I said, what if they asked whether there was authorization on record and the person they spoke to couldn't immediately locate it? Diane said that would be a training issue, not a reflection of the actual record. My mother was still looking at the screen. Her hands were in her lap. Diane said she'd give us a moment and stepped out and closed the door softly. The room was very quiet. There is a clock on the wall of that office, a simple round clock, and I could hear it. I didn't say anything. I sat with my hands in my lap and I let my mother look at the screen for as long as she needed to. She said, finally, he didn't show me this. I said, I know. She said he showed me a printout, just the account ending in zeros, a zero balance, and the date it went to zero. I said he didn't show you the transfer record. She said he said there wasn't one. I said there is one, you're looking at it. She said he told me the bank cameras would show you going in and taking it out in cash. The cold feeling behind my collarbone again, not anger, cold and specific. I said, Mom, it was a wire transfer. There are no cameras relevant to a wire transfer. There's a computer record with my name on the authorization and your name on the receiving account and a filing number attached to a document my father signed and Keith Satterfield notarized. She looked at the screen for a long time, then she looked at me. Her eyes were wet at the edges, but she was holding it the way my father used to hold things, the way that looks like stillness and isn't. She said, Renata, he was so certain. I said yes. She said he has been certain about this since February. I said, I know. She said he called Glenn, he called Vic Bowen. Something in my jaw tightened. I unclenched it deliberately. I said, what did he tell them? She said that money was missing, that it had been taken, that you were the only one who had access. I said he told them that. She said, honey, he believed it. I sat with that. I have sat with that sentence more times than I can count since that morning in May. She wasn't defending him, she was being accurate. She was giving me the most honest version of what she understood to be true. And I think she was right, which is not the same as thinking what he did was acceptable, but it is the truth as I understand it. I said, what do you want to do about this? She said, what do you want to do? I said I want to send him the complete documentation, the power of attorney, the transfer record, the account statements, a letter from Keith explaining the estate procedure, and I want that letter to go to Vic Bowen and Terrence Bowen and Glenn Purifoy, every person who was in that kitchen. She nodded, she said, and then. I said, and then I want to see what he does. She nodded again. She reached over and put her hand on my arm for a second and then pulled it back. She said, I'm sorry. I should have asked you directly before I let any of this get to where it got. I said you were grieving. She said, Renata, so were you. I let that sit. Diane came back in after a few minutes and printed a complete transaction history for the account and a copy of the authorization record, and I signed a request for the official documentation package to be mailed to Keith Satterfield's office. Diane also printed the joint account summary from BB&T showing both names. She did all of this without any drama. She was precise and professional, and she thanked us for coming in. My mother and I walked out to the parking lot together. She stopped beside her car and she said, when did your father set that account up? I said October of 2020. He asked me to do it. He wanted you to have access to the money, but he wanted it somewhere separate. She looked at me for a moment and then she looked at the parking lot, the strip of grass along the fence, a bird sitting on the fence post that was watching us or not watching us, hard to say. She said, he never told me. I said, I know. She said, he thought he was protecting me. I said, yes. She said, and instead. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. I said, Mom, the money is safe, everything is documented, this is going to be okay. She said, I know it is. She got in her car. Keith Satterfield sent the documentation packet on May 12, 2021. Cover letter on Satterfield in Bloom letterhead, 2 pages, clear, chronological. It explained the power of attorney and its date of execution. It explained my role as agent and the specific transaction at First Citizens. It explained the joint account and its 2 holders. It attached the transfer record, the account summary, and the copy of the power of attorney instrument itself. Keith does not write letters that leave room for interpretation. He writes letters that arrive and do their job and stop. Per my request, certified mail copies went to Darren's address in Raleigh, to Vic Bowen's address in Garner, to Terrence Bowen's address in Clayton, and to Glenn Purifoy's house, which was 3 houses down from my mother's on Timber Glen Court. Darren called me 9 days later, May 21st, a Friday afternoon. I was at my desk at Aldridge and Mercer and my phone rang with his number and I looked at it for a full ring before I picked it up. He said, I got the documents. I said, I know. The pause that came after that was the working kind. I have learned to identify the different textures of silence in phone calls, and this one was a person figuring out the shape of what they're about to say. He said I didn't know about the joint account. I said the joint account was created in October 2020 at Dad's request. It was in the estate file. You had access to the same documents I did. He said Keith didn't walk me through that part. I said Keith walked me through everything in January. We had the same meeting. You didn't come to yours. He was quiet. I said, Darren, when you stood in Mom's kitchen on Easter, had you already seen the transfer record from First Citizens? Pause. He said I'd seen something from the bank. I said, had you seen the power of attorney filing on the transfer? He said, I don't think I understood what I was looking at. I thought about pushing. I thought about the clean, bright line of making him say the actual thing out loud, say that he had seen enough to know the transfer was authorized and had accused me anyway, or say that he had genuinely not understood it, which would mean something different but not necessarily better. I thought about every version of this conversation and what each version would cost. I have been in enough rooms with people who have a story about themselves that they cannot afford to relinquish. I know what happens when you try to take that story by force. You don't get the truth, you get the bunker version. So I said, okay, I understand. He said I was trying to protect the estates. I thought someone had taken advantage of Dad. I said, Darren, I managed your father's finances for 22 months. Every transaction, every account, every time something needed to be moved or adjusted because the medical bills changed things. I did that without a single discrepancy. And you have known since 2011 what I do for a living. You knew exactly what you were saying in that kitchen. He didn't respond to that. I said I need you to call Mom and tell her what the documents say. I need you to call Vic, Terrence, Glenn Purifoy. I need you to correct the record with every person who was in that kitchen. He said I'll do that. I said the money stays where it is. He said yeah, I know. I said goodbye and ended the call. I put my phone face down on my desk and looked at the wall of my office, which has a window that faces the parking deck across the street. Not much of a view. I sat with my hands in my lap and I breathed. My shoulders came down about 2 inches and I understood only then how long I had been holding them up. Now here is where I have to correct something I told you earlier. When I described not calling Darren right after the January estate meeting with Keith, I called that my second mistake. The bigger one. I want to revise that because I have been telling this story long enough to see it from more angles now, and what I called my mistake was actually something else. The thing I did, which was choose not to force a conversation with a grieving man in the middle of January, was a reasonable human choice made in a moment of exhaustion and grief. What created the conditions for everything that followed was a different thing, and it was not mine to carry. My father, the man who underlined my name on a legal pad, the man who sat across from me in that kitchen in February 2019 with cold coffee and told me he wanted to give me something while he could still watch it happen, that man made a choice. When I asked him what Darren knew about the First Citizens account and he said enough, he was wrong. Not about what he wanted, not about who I am. He was wrong about what enough would be capable of holding once he wasn't there to hold it with it. He knew his son 40 years of. Knowing him, he knew what Darren did with gaps. He knew that incomplete information in the wrong hands becomes the raw material of certainty. And he left the gap anyway, maybe because he was tired, maybe because he could feel what was left of the time and he did not want to spend any of it on that particular hard conversation. Maybe because he wanted to believe that the people who loved him would handle things gracefully without needing every single guardrail set in place. I understand all of those reasons. I carry them without bitterness mostly. But the fact remains that when I walked into that kitchen on Easter, I was walking into a space that my father had partially constructed through the things he hadn't said, and I was the one who had to stand in it with my coat half off my shoulder. You don't get to love someone perfectly just because they're dying. That is the truest sentence I know how to say about this whole story. My father loved me. My father left a gap that swallowed 3 months of my life and put my name in the mouths of people who had watched me grow up. Both things are true, both things are him. My mother told me in August that Darren had made the calls. She said Vic Bowen had told her that Darren called him on a Tuesday night and explained that he'd been wrong about the account. Vic told her that Darren had said there was documentation he hadn't seen. Vic told her the conversation was short. I don't know what exactly was said and I didn't ask. I know the call happened. I know Terrence got a similar call. I know Glenn Purifoy said something to my mother's sister Phillies about it. What was said in those calls, whether Darren said I was wrong or I made a mistake or I misread the records, I don't know. The record was corrected. That is what I had asked for. Let me back up again because I skipped something. In the weeks between Easter and the Thursday at the bank, between leaving my mother's kitchen with my coat half on and sitting across from Diane Ackhofer, there was a conversation I have never told anyone in full. I am going to tell it now because I think it matters to the actual shape of this story, even though it makes me look like something less than the composed woman I have been presenting to you. 10 days after Easter, I drove back down to Garner, not for any appointment, not to meet anyone. I drove down on a Wednesday evening after work and I drove through the neighborhood and I parked in front of my parents' house and I sat in the car for about 20 minutes. The lights were on inside. I could see my mother moving in the kitchen, the silhouette of her. I knew she could probably see my car if she looked out the window. I didn't get out. I sat there and I thought about what it would mean if I was wrong. Not about the transfer. I was not wrong about the transfer. The documents were clear and I knew it. I mean wrong about the other thing. I thought about the version of events in which Darren genuinely hadn't understood the transfer record. The version where he saw a zero balance and a date and built a story in good faith out of those two facts because he was grieving and worried and didn't have the rest. I sat in that car and I gave that version every inch of room I could because I am someone who has spent my professional life understanding that the story people tell in their own heads is usually the most coherent story available to them given what they have, and that the gap between their story and the actual story is almost never filled with malice. It is filled with incomplete information. That is what I know about human beings. That is what I have seen over and over in my work. I gave that version real room. I sat in the car in front of my parents' house in the dark for 20 minutes and I let it exist. And then I thought about the power of attorney, the filing number on the transfer record, the fact that power of attorney instruments are public record, and the fact that Darren had been going through my father's documents for months, and the fact that he is not a careless person when it comes to financial matters. He is a commercial real estate agent who reads contracts for a living. I thought about the way he had said, I've talked to people at the bank, to my mother in a way that implied investigation rather than inquiry. I thought about the 11 people and why you would choose to have that conversation with 11 people present rather than with your sister in private. I didn't arrive at a clean answer. I am still not at a clean answer all these years later. I think the truth is somewhere in the middle, and the middle is not a comfortable place. I think he saw something and he built a story, and he was not careful enough about checking whether the story was true before he started telling it, and I think that lack of care is its own kind of choice, not a conscious, malicious choice, but not an innocent accident either, something in between, the gray space where most real human wrongdoing lives. I started the car, I drove home to Durham's. There is one other thing I have been avoiding, which is a phone call I got in June of 2021, 3 weeks after the documentation went out and 1 week after my call with Darren. I got a call from a number I didn't recognize, and I answered it because I was in a habit of answering unknown numbers during that period. It was Vic Bowen. He said, Renata, it's Vic. I said, hi, Vic. He said, I want to say something and then I don't want to make a big thing of it. I said, okay. He said, Darren called me. I said, I know he was going to. He said, he explained about the account. I said, yes. Vic was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I've known you since you were 8 years old. I've known your father since I was 22. And I should have asked you a question before I stood in that kitchen and let what happened happen without saying something. I said, Vic, you didn't owe me anything in that moment. There was no way to know. He said, I know your father for 30 years and I know what kind of man he was about money and I know what kind of person he raised. I should have known better than to stand there quiet. I didn't say anything for a moment. Vic is not a person who performs emotion. He is a 62-year-old man who grew up in Johnston County and worked construction in the Raleigh area for 4 decades and keeps his words close to himself unless there is a real reason to spend them. This was the most words I had ever heard him use on the phone in one stretch. I said, thank you, Vic, I mean that. He said, yes, ma'am, and then he said, your father, he was something. I said, he was. Vic said, we don't make them like that anymore. I said, I know we don't. He said goodbye and hung up, and I sat in my office at Aldridge and Mercer and looked at the parking deck across the street, and the thing behind my sternum, the thing that had been tight and cold since April, loosened the smallest amount. Not gone, just loosened, which was enough for that day. I went back to work on the property management fraud case. I finished the report in July. The company's owner, a man named Parsons, had been skimming from the maintenance reserves of 15 residential properties for 4 years, a total of $238,000 redirected to a separate LLC registered in his wife's maiden name in South Carolina. The case went to the Wake County DA's office in August. Parsons was indicted in October. I read the indictment in my office on a Tuesday afternoon and I thought about how clean it all looks when it's written down, the amounts and the dates and the instruments, how clean and damning and obvious, and how none of that cleanness was available to anyone at the beginning, how someone had to do the work of assembling it. That is the part of my job I have always understood in my body rather than my head. The work of assembling the actual record out of the pieces that were always there but hadn't been put together yet. The record exists before you find it. You are not creating it, you are just arriving at it. I arrived at my own record in a branch manager's office on Highway 70 in Garner on a Thursday in May. It had been there the whole time. Darren did not apologize to me directly, not in words, not on that call in May or in any call after it. What happened instead in September of 2021 was that he called me on a Sunday afternoon about a refinancing question on one of the Garner rental properties. It was a complicated question involving the current rates and whether it made sense given my mother's income situation. We talked for 40 minutes. He asked intelligent questions. I gave him my honest analysis. We talked like two people who have known each other their whole lives and understand each other's intelligence even when they do not understand each other. We never mentioned any of it. That 40-minute call is, I think, the closest thing we have to an apology and an acknowledgement. I have thought about it many times. I don't entirely know what to do with it. There is something else I want to tell you about the 6 weeks between Easter and the Friday when I got off the phone with Darren and put my phone face down on my desk. I want to tell you about going to work every day during those 6 weeks and doing my job the way I always did it. That sounds unremarkable, I know it does. But I want you to understand what that took because I think it is the part of this story that I am actually most proud of and also the part I never talk about. I work in a field where credibility is everything. Not likability, not personality, not whether the people across the conference table enjoy having me in the room. Credibility, the confidence that what I hand you is correct and complete and has not been filtered through anything except accuracy. I have spent 14 years building that credibility, and it lives mostly in the fact that when I say something is true, it is true, and when I say I don't know, I mean I don't know, and I am telling you that directly rather than guessing. That is the foundation. Darren didn't tell anyone at my firm. This was not an organized campaign to ruin my professional life. It was a family matter and it stayed in that family orbit, which is a mercy I didn't think about until later, but I thought about it. I thought during those 6 weeks about what it would mean if someone at work knew, about the particular unreachability of the kind of suspicion that has a number attached to it, about how quickly a person's credibility calcifies into something else once someone has said they stole money in front of 11 people. I thought about that every single day. And I went to work, I sat at my desk, and I worked the property management fraud case. I reviewed bank records, I traced transfers, I wrote the analytical framework for a supplemental report, I attended a Monday morning case review and presented my findings with the same level of preparation I always bring, and my supervisor Elaine thanked me and moved to the next item on the agenda. I ate lunch in my office most days that month. Tuna sandwiches from a place on Mangum Street that I liked and that had good pickles. I called my mother twice a week. I waited for Keith's documentation. I did my job. I am telling you this because I think the version of events that makes me look best, the version that would be most satisfying to tell, is the one where I immediately knew what to do and did it with clarity and quiet confidence, and the record proved everything in a clean arc. And that version is true. But underneath, it is also the 6 weeks of going to work and eating tuna sandwiches and not knowing exactly how it was all going to resolve, and that version is also true, and it is the one that actually required something from me. I was 46 days between the Easter kitchen and the Friday call with Darren. I counted, not obsessively, just in the way you count things that have a weight. 46 days during which 11 people, including 2 men who had known me since I was a child, had a version of the story that said I was a thief. 46 days during which my mother was living inside a version of events that did not have my name on the receiving account. 46 days. I have thought about what my father would say about those 46 days. I think he would say you handled it right. I think he would say you let the record do its job. I think he might also say I'm sorry I left the gap because he was a man who, when he was wrong, said so. That's where I get it actually, that directness, that willingness to sit with the full accounting. I am not able to have that conversation with him. That is the thing about all of this that has nothing to do with banks or accounts or documents or anything that can be fixed. He is not here and I cannot tell him how any of it turned out, and I cannot hear him say the thing he would have said if he could have. That is the part of this story that does not resolve. The rest of it resolved. That part stays the way it is. There is a last thing I want to say about Stacy, Darren's wife. I have not talked about her much in this story, and I want to give her the full accounting she deserves, which is to say I don't know what she knew or when she knew it. I do not know whether she was present for the moment Darren decided to take what he had seen from the bank and build it into what he told 11 people in that kitchen. I don't know if she asked questions. I don't know if she was the person who suggested having that conversation at Easter in front of other people, or if that was him alone. I do not know how much of this was a together decision and how much was his alone, and I have made my peace with not knowing. What I do know is that she was holding that dish towel in both hands and she set it down on the counter behind her without looking at it, a very small movement when my brother started talking. I noticed it because I notice small movements. That is my job and also by now my personality. I noticed it and I have thought about it since, and what I think it means is that she knew in some version that what was about to happen was significant, not necessarily that it was wrong, but that it was significant. That dish towel set down on the counter without looking is the one moment in that kitchen that I can't fully interpret and probably never will. I saw Stacy at a cousin's birthday party in September of 2022. Not Darren's side of the family, my mother's side. A party for Phyllis's grandson who was turning 7 in a backyard in Fukivarina. Stacy was there because Darren's family and my mother's family had been entwined long enough that she got invited to things on both sides. We stood next to each other at the food table for about 2 minutes while we were both getting fruit salad. She said, "It's good to see you, Renata." I said, "You too?" She said, "The kids are getting so big." I said, "They really are." And then we both moved back to our separate parts of the yard. Those were all the words we said, and neither of us pretended it was more than it was, and I thought that was the right amount. I have been back to Garner for other things. My mother's birthday in August, which she usually wants to spend quietly, just the two of us, dinner somewhere nice. I take her to an Italian place on Rand Mill Road in Garner that she likes, the one that has been there for 20 years, the one where the owner still comes to the table and where the linguine with clams is worth tea. Holloway construction lettering on the side, and I think about my father's hands and the particular care he took in his work, and the way his crew would tell you, if you asked them, that he never had to raise his voice on a job site to get what he needed because he was so clear about what he needed that raising his voice was never necessary. I think about that when I am at work. I think about it when I am in a conference room presenting findings to a board of directors or sitting across from someone who thought they had hidden something and is now understanding that they hadn't. I don't raise my voice either. I let the record do what I came there to let it do. I step back, I wait. It always lands. I have not been back to Easter dinner at my mother's house since 2021, not because of a decision I made, just because things shifted. Last Easter, she came up to Durham and we went to brunch at a restaurant on 9th Street and she ordered the to what? On the first page, below the first citizen's account number, below the balance figure written in his careful numerical hand, my name is written in full. Renata Claire Holloway. And under that, one underline, not two, just one, the way you underline something when you need to make sure you meant it and you mean it and you want the page to hold that fact so it doesn't drift. He meant it, I know he meant it. Some nights when I'm working late and the house is quiet, I open that drawer and I look at the first page. I don't take it out. I just look at it in the drawer, the yellow of the paper gone a little more yellow from 2 years of being in the dark, and the handwriting still his handwriting, still exactly the specific weight of a man who held a pen the same way he held a pencil level on a framing square. Carefully, deliberately, the way you hold something you know how to use. That is where the legal pad sits now, in the drawer.